Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Gunther, and for this series, we're going to be focusing on applied learning theory using this ginormous book, the Cambridge Handbook of Multimedia Learning. We're going to get started with cognitive load theory and move into cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So the cognitive load theory is made up of 5 basic principles, and these principles are built into what we call the human cognitive architecture. The first principle is the information store principle, really just focusing on long-term memory, how we access and alter that information to facilitate learning. Then we move into the borrowing and reorganizing principle. I kind of see this as a monkey see, monkey do type thing. You don't know, you look around, figure out what everybody else is doing, imitate them, maybe put your own spin on it, and then stick it in your long-term memory. And then we move on to the randomness as genesis principle. This is a guess and check type principle where, once again, you don't know, and so you just take a shot in the dark. Hopefully it works. If it does, long-term memory. If it doesn't, try it again. And then we move on to the narrow limits of change principle, really just focusing on how minute our working memory is. We can really only process about 7 pieces of information-ish for about 20 seconds without rehearsal. This is good because this allows us to really focus on one piece of information without it getting gunked up by a bunch of other foolishness. And then finally, our environmental organizing and linking principle. Our professor referred to this as the context matters principle. You look at the knowledge currently stored in your long-term memory and see how it applies to the situation at hand. So these principles are really important to keep in mind when we're discussing how we acquire and store information in our long-term memory and our working memories. A very important piece of this puzzle is the cognitive load conditions, and these focus on how much you can learn and when can you learn. So we're going to start off with the intrinsic cognitive load, and this is really focusing on what do you need to know, what do you already know, and this can really vary from person to person. Then we move into our extraneous cognitive load. This is all of the extra foolishness that is distracting us from what we are trying to learn. Now, these 2 cognitive loads, intrinsic and extraneous, are additive. So if you have a lot of one and a lot of the other, just forget about it, call it a day. But germane cognitive load theory really is about the amount of working memory that we have available to that intrinsic cognitive load. We really briefly discussed cognitive load theory. Now we're going to roll directly into the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. In this particular theory, we really focus on how words and pictures come together to stimulate learning via any medium. And an appropriately constructed multimedia lesson is really going to focus on the 3 demands of the learner's cognitive capacity. That very first demand is extraneous processing. Once again, this is the stuff that distracts from the learning process, usually not related to learning and is usually the result of a poor instructional design. Our next is the essential processing, and this processing is done to represent the most important pieces of information in our working memory. And the third and final demand is the generative processing. And this is making sense of the information we've been given and tying it into the information we already have in our long-term memory. And as you might notice, this definitely requires motivation on the part of the learner. So that leads us directly into the 3 assumptions of the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. The first theory is dual channels, the assumption that we are processing information via visual channel and an auditory channel, which leads directly to the second assumption, limited capacity. And this refers to the limited amount of data that we can process in each of those channels, the visual and auditory channels, at a given time. And then finally, the third assumption is active processing. This particular assumption deals with three different components: attending to the most important information, organizing that information into something that makes sense for the learner, and then integrating that information with the information that you already have in your long-term memory. You'll notice that both of these theories, the cognitive load theory and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, are very, very similar. They both confirm that we have the three different types of memory. We have working memory, long-term memory, and schemas. And then we also discuss the three ways that knowledge and information are gathered, processed, and archived. I hope you enjoyed this really fast lesson, and I look forward to seeing you next time.